Paul Bernardo is an infamous Canadian. Born and raised in Scarborough, Ontario, at one time Paul was a handsome and nice young man that lived a seemingly normal life. It was later discovered that behind his blue eyes were disgusting desires and fantasies that would earn him titles like the schoolgirl killer and the Scarborough rapist.
Paul Bernardo was a serial killer and serial rapist. He committed 3 murders, 13 rapes, and attempted 6 rapes. Paul was initially known for serial rape incidents in his hometown of Scarborough between 1987 and 1990. He then went on to commit 3 murders with his wife at the time, Karla Homolka.
As a young boy, Paul was described as always happy and cute, and it is said that he was polite, intelligent, and sweet. However, while growing up, Paul had less than ideal father figure to idolize. His father, Kenneth, had fondled a young girl and was charged with molestation in 1975. He also sexually abused his daughter, Paul's sister. They seemed to influence Paul's behavior and ideals of women. Behind his sweet boy facade, Paul had dark sexual fantasies. He liked humiliating women publicly and even beat the women he dated.
Paul Bernardo's criminal nature began at a very early age, but his first recorded incident was a sexual assault on May 4th, 1987. Throughout his early life, he had always mistreated women. In fact, some women noticed a red flag when they read his yearbook quote. Stead will remember Laurier, where he pursued his favorite pastime, meeting females. He plans to become rich and famous so he can go to California and check out the girls on the beach. Paul says the only way to go through life is to go for it.
Paul seems to have always had a hatred and odd behavior towards women. When he was 16, his mother told him he was conceived illegitimately during an affair, and in response, Paul openly insulted her. Paul also practiced pickup techniques on young women at bars with his buddies, luring them with a sense of charm that would later turn violent and assaultive. Another red flag with Paul is the fact that he was interested in the American Psycho novel and apparently read it as his Bible.
Paul Bernardo had many documented crimes, and almost all of them were sexual assaults. He was known as the Scarborough rapist for many obvious reasons. Paul committed multiple sexual assaults. Most of his victims he would stalk when they walked home from the bus. Many of his victims were 15 to 16 years of age, others being in their late 20s. In total, Paul had 19 incidents of rape, including attempted, that were documented. But it was very possible that there were many other unknown incidents.
Starting in May of 1987 and ending in May of 1990, Paul Bernardo was responsible for 18 known rapes and sexual assaults in the suburbs of Toronto. These assaults earned him the nickname of the Scarborough Rapist. A composite sketch given by one of his victims would eventually lead to his arrest several years later.
On October 17, 1987, Paul Bernardo met his wife, Karla Homolka, in a hotel bar. Homolka would go on to be an accomplice in all of Bernardo's murders and many of his future sexual assaults. Paul was 23 and Karla was 17. Their friends claim it was love at first sight.
Bernardo became increasingly fixated on Karla's younger sister Tammy as their relationship grew. Upset by the fact that Karla was not a virgin when they met, Bernardo wanted to take Tammy's virginity because she bore a resemblance to Karla. On the night of December 23, 1990, the couple drugged and raped Tammy, who began to throw up and choke on her own vomit. The couple clothed themselves and Tammy before calling 911. Tammy never regained consciousness and was pronounced dead on Christmas Eve of 1990.
June 15, 1991, Bernardo woke Homolka in the middle of the night with a present. Bernardo had abducted 14-year-old Leslie Mahaffey by luring her into his car with promises of a cigarette. Bernardo had plans of keeping her hostage as a sex slave. The couple raped Mahaffey several times over the span of 24 hours before strangling her to death. Bernardo then dismembered her body into 8 pieces and encased them in concrete blocks before dumping the blocks into nearby Lake Gibson. This murder occurred 2 weeks before their wedding.
On April 16, 1992, Bernardo and his wife abducted 15-year-old Kristen French from a church parking lot. Over the course of several days, the couple raped and assaulted her several times before strangling her to death. French's body was found 2 weeks later in a roadside ditch. Between these two murders, Bernardo and his wife would lure Tammy's friends to their house. They would drug and rape them the same way they raped Tammy. However, none of these victims died, and none have any recollection of the events.
The investigation of Paul Bernardo began in May of 1990, when a composite sketch of the Scarborough rapist was released and his friends began to call him in to authorities. Bernardo was questioned by police and voluntarily offered DNA samples. Because of his cooperation with police, he was released and not thought of as a suspect.
In January of 1993, Paul severely beat Carla with a flashlight, causing their relationship to fracture. Around this time, the DNA samples Bernardo provided over 2 years ago were finally tested positively, identifying him as a Scarborough rapist. Investigators then became aware that he was living in the area where French and Mahaffey were killed. Bernardo then became a prime suspect.
Carla was then questioned with members of the Green Ribbon Task Force present about the Scarborough rapist. After Carla confessed everything to her family. Then, as a result of the information given by Carla, Paul Bernardo was arrested by the police on February 17, 1993.
To protect Bernardo's rights, the Crown decided to put a publication ban on the trial in Paula Homolka's initial inquiry. For those of you who don't know, a publication ban is an order a court would make to stop people from getting the specifics about a case. It was done to make sure no one outside of the investigation in courts knew specific names, places, or times. The entire idea is to prevent interference from outside sources. But this didn't stop people out of province or country from distributing what they had already gathered. The UK and the US specifically had a fun time distributing the details by radio, newspaper, or TV.
The trials for Bernardo and Homolka were pretty straightforward in terms of the Canadian justice system. Both Bernardo and Homolka took turns throwing each other under the bus and denying claims and evidence. One thing to note was how the videos of the killings were handled, specifically by Bernardo's lawyer. The lawyer, whose name is Ken Murray, withheld the tapes of the rape or murders for 17 months. Although holding on to crucial evidence like that is totally obstruction of justice, he was acquitted. On September 1st, 1995, the courts decided to convict him with a number of offenses, including 2 first-degree murders and 2 aggravated sexual assaults.
So obviously this psycho went to jail. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole for at least 25 years. So he's neck deep in prison. Bernardo was sent to Kensington Penitentiary initially and was moved on September 2013 to Millhaven Institution when Kingston closed down. He was labeled a dangerous offender and put into segregation for most of his stay, but that didn't stop inmates from wanting a piece. In 1996, Bernardo was punched coming out of a shower, and in 1999, 5 inmates tried to rush into his cell but got stopped by a riot squad.
After Bernardo's conviction in 1995, Ontario took a real good look at how something like this could happen on their watch. Upon investigation, it was clear that lack of communication was the biggest issue, not just by police, but communication between every level of the judiciary system that had concerned this case. So Ontario's solution to this was to implement yet another system to try and solve the lack of communication. What they ended up coming up with is a computer system that organizes investigations of homicide and sexual assault. Ontario is the only place in the world with their type of management system, so something good actually did come out of this.
Although held in what is essentially a small and secure box, Bernardo still had ways of making headlines behind bars. As mentioned, his case is the reason why the Ontario created their special management system that helps OPP organize their case data better. The Toronto Star reported that Bernardo apparently admitted to sexually assaulting another 10 women that were never mentioned beforehand. Bernardo scored 35 out of 40 on the psychopathy checklist, which classifies him as a clinical basket case. He also self-published a fictional book on Amazon titled A Mad World Order. The book was a bestseller until someone figured out that the author was a serial killer and removed it.
Other than being in jail, Bernardo isn't up to much these days. The most recent headline is in October 2018. Bernardo was found to have a shank in his possession and was set to go to trial, but the prosecution dropped the charges because the evidence that it was actually his was shaky. And why would he need a shank if he's confined anyway? Although this didn't make headlines, Bernardo became eligible for parole in February 2018. He is obviously denied day parole and full parole. Hopefully this is where the story ends, with the psychopath behind bars until the end of his life.